called the cerebellum, protruding from the president's head wound. The cerebellum is located at the extreme back of the head.
And a portion of the cerebellum fell out onto the table as we were doing the tracheostomy.
It did.
Mm-hmm.
So the wound was very far back here.
Right. That's one of my more vivid memories, I will say, the whole thing. That was particularly grim to see that portion of the brain ooze out of the wound as I sat there looking at it, stood there looking at it. So that stays with me pretty much.
The Dallas doctor's recollections about an exit wound in the back of the president's head are confirmed by witnesses at the Bethesda Hospital autopsy.
I mean, a big gaping hole in the back of the head. It was like somebody put a piece of dynamite in a tin can and lighted it off. There was nothing there. Open area all the way across into the rear of the brain like that.
From the top of the head almost back to near the base of the skull. It seemed that part was gone.
So eyewitnesses in Dallas and Bethesda describe a wound extending all the way to the back of the head. But official autopsy photos and x-rays move the wound all the way to the front of the head. The photos show the back of the head with hair and scalp intact. No large wound. The x-rays show a large wound extending to the forehead.
Certainly I can tell you that the wound was not here. There was no damage to the face that was visible.
The autopsy photographs which I've worked with, which I've seen several times since the late 1970s, show a totally different set of wounds, especially the rear of the head. The one in the rear of the head is absolutely nowhere near what any of the doctors described.
What about the official photos and x-rays? We showed them to the 3 eyewitnesses to JFK's autopsy. Photos and x-rays not available to the public since the assassination. Gerald Custer took the x-rays that night. Is this the x-ray picture that you took, and is this the wound that you saw on the president?
This area here was gone.
Not.
Not this area.
Floyd Rigby assisted with the autopsy photos.
The 2 pictures that I've seen that you showed me are supposedly from the archives are not what I saw that night. I don't know where those pictures came from.
The back of the head looked like that. What did the back of the head look like?
It had a big hole in it. This whole area was gone.
Does that look like what you saw?
No, it doesn't look like what I saw. This would be a lesser wound than what I saw. I saw a lot worse wound that extended way back into this area here. When I first saw the pictures of the president's body, so-called wounds, what really struck me was, especially the head wound, they showed a nice little neat round bullet hole in the back of his head. Well, actually what I saw was the whole side of his head blown off. It was gone. I don't know where those things came from, but they're totally wrong. Every one of them.
Was the president's hair and scalp like that?
No.
What was it like?
This part of the head was gone. There was no scalp there.
I could put both my hands right inside the skull cavity. And like I had mentioned, that I could brought my hands back and there were still little pieces of brain cells that I had to take off my hands. And there was no blood on it. At one point you actually did? Yeah, I put my hands right inside the skull. And I made a comment to Reed that, my God, look at the size of this hole.
Dr. Robert McClellan was one of the first surgeons in the emergency room when the president was brought in. He is disturbed about the autopsy x-rays, which also failed to show a wound to the back of the head.
But there's an inconsistency. Some of the skull x-rays show only the back part of the head missing with a fracture up in the anterior part of the skull on the right. Others, on the other hand, show what appears to be the entire right side of the skull gone, with a portion of the orbit, that is the skull around the eye, missing too. And that, to me, is an inconsistent finding. I don't understand that unless there has been some attempt to cover up the nature of the wounds.
Are you telling me that this is not?
I don't believe so.
You don't think this is a honest about? Autopsy photo?
No, I didn't.
What do you think it is?
I don't know.
If the official government autopsy photos or the x-rays were somehow altered, the question is why?
The autopsy photographs show a massive wound, but it's in the right temporal area and into the parietal area, which is behind it, between the two. It is inconceivable to me that every single one of the witnesses who saw the president's head could be wrong, and specifically wrong, about this particular wound. They describe an avulsed, exploded open wound in the rear of the head. In the autopsy photograph, you see a small, neat wound at entrance. It's obvious to me that those photographs have been faked.
We're not a free country anymore, because the people who are smart enough and powerful enough to take out a president like that and get away with it for 25 years are probably involved in other areas of the government. In other words, the country is being run by people we did not vote for.
If it could be done to John F. Kennedy in 1963, it could be done to another president in the future. And we can't afford to have coup d'etats in America, no matter how cleverly orchestrated and sinisterly contrived they may be. That cannot be permitted to happen. And the way in which you prevent that from happening is to expose those elements of government and society in this country that were responsible for the killing of John F. Kennedy.
It angers me terribly that we don't know the truth. And the arrogance of those in power that continue to cover up in the lie is beyond tolerance.
It's being phony someplace. It's make-believe.
And now we'll deal with disinformation and Bill Cooper.
Some of you may be familiar with a story put forward by a character named Bill Cooper, a man who nobody in his right mind would take seriously. Bill Cooper states that at the moment of the assassination, the Secret Service driver of the limousine, Bill Greer, turns around and shoots President Kennedy. This is an unaltered version of the film taken directly from the original. It clearly shows the reactions of all the occupants of the car, including the driver and guard. We'll now see a blow-up showing Bill Greer, the driver, and Roy Kellerman, the man sitting next to him, the Secret Service guard. Advancing the film one frame at a time, we see Greer and Kellerman in the front seat, Governor and Mrs. Connolly in the center, President and Mrs. Kennedy in the rear. Notice the reflection of the sunlight off of Roy Kellerman's forehead and the top of his hair. That's the shade that Bill Cooper is calling a gun. In his version of the film, he has eliminated the color, and he's eliminated the grayscale in the film. So all you see is high contrast, black and white. By doing this, he eliminates the skin tone of Roy Kellerman and Bill Greer. Here we're zooming in and we see Roy Kellerman's face very clearly and the shape that Cooper calls a gun. Notice that Bill Greer's hands are both on the steering wheel, both his left and right hands at the moment of the headshot. This is one frame before the headshot, frame 312. And here, at frame 313, the moment of the headshot, Greer's hands are still both in evidence at the steering wheel. Cooper is aware that it is merely the sunlight reflected off the top of Roy Kellerman's head that he is calling a gun. Here's Cooper's version.
What we're observing here is the motorcade in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. As the presidential car passes behind the freeway sign, President Kennedy is struck in the throat by a bullet that was fired from the grassy knoll. As he's grasping his throat, John Connolly is turning around to his right. He at that point is struck. You notice the the passenger of the car turning back to see what has happened to the president. As he turns back to the front, the driver of the car turns with his left arm over his right shoulder with a pistol and fires. You see the 45 caliber nickel-plated automatic weapon in his left hand. He's firing over his right shoulder. You see it in relief. You see his head pointing backwards towards the president. Here you see the passenger in the front turning back, looking at the president. Instead of jumping back to the system, he turns forward. The driver's now rotating. The weapon comes into view and he fires. You'll see this repeatedly in these sequences. Kennedy's been shot in the throat. He's leaning to his left. The driver now begins to rotate. His left arm comes over his right shoulder, and he fires now. Again, you see the driver rotate, you see the weapon come into view. He's rotating again, the weapon is in view, he fires. You can clearly see his head turning and his arm and the weapon extending into view over his right shoulder.
By purposely using a substandard version of the Zapruder film and the power of suggestion, Cooper has been able to mislead audiences for quite a while now into believing that Bill Greer shot the president. He has been informed of the true nature of the film, but he refuses to admit that to the public, and goes on charging a small fortune to audiences to hear him spread the lie about Bill Greer being the man who shot the president. The real issue is, why did Bill Greer slow the car down? Did he know he was driving into the fire and shot from the grassy knoll? We'll never know the truth as long as we are led to believe a malicious fairy tale is put forward by Bill Cooper. One issue that Cooper refuses to deal with is the fact that Governor Connolly's head would have been in the way. If indeed Greer had fired at this point, the bullet would have had to pass right through Governor Connolly's head in order to hit the president. This apparently didn't bother Cooper very much, but I tend to believe it would have bothered Governor Connolly. You guys have been most patient and very, very gracious, and I appreciate it. We are actually running about on time, maybe a little bit late, and it's been suggested that I give you guys the option of a question and answer period, or going to lunch, or dinner rather, or for those who want to do something, do one, some of the other. I promised I would stay and answer your questions, and I will. Do you have questions?
Yeah. Did anyone ever discuss the fact that the driver immediately took off after the first shot of the scene, driving slow, someone said the driver right at the corner of the witness. What do you guys think?
Okay, the question is, I'll repeat the question so I know you can't all hear it. The question is, does anyone question the fact that the driver, Bill Greer, did not accelerate and take off? Yes, we have. I certainly have for years. Since about 1972 or 73, I specifically started raising that question because I thought it was a very valid question. And I think that possibly the answer might be that he realized he was driving into the fire, that the shooting was coming from the front, and he didn't want to drive toward the gunman. We can't ask him that now because he's dead. And when did he die? Several years ago. 85, was it? 85.
Robert?
Yes.
But it's a fact that every inch of training, the Secret Service says, the minute there's a problem, bam, you step on the gas. And how can a man who's been trained like that react in such a way when he's looking right at the man and sees him shot?
Okay, the question is, considering the way the Secret Service experts are trained, how could he not respond faster? How could he have slowed down and done exactly the wrong thing instead of the right thing? It's easy for us, myself included, to condemn what happened. But these guys spend hours and hours, days and days, weeks, months and months, waiting for something like this to happen. And after a while, they don't believe it ever will. And then when it finally does, they can't believe it's really happening. I don't know. I personally question that. I think that Bill Greer definitely should have officially been asked why he didn't accelerate. Not behind closed doors, but in the public. It has been pointed out, in fact, we do that in high treason, that when Greer, Kellerman, and Hill left the questioning session at the Warren Commission, that they were smiling, real bright smiles, after just testifying about what should have been the most horrible and serious moment of their lives. I question. Can you hold this for a second? Yes.
Two things. We're going to let Bob run his question and answer period because I think he can handle at least as well as I can with running around with the microphone. make certain that everyone hears your questions so that Bob doesn't have to keep on repeating them. No, wait a minute. And then remember that we're going to start at 6 sharp. So if this goes until 5 to 6, got it? At 6 o'clock, we'll start the next program. One comment. Vince Palomaro, who is not here, is working on a major book on the Secret Service and the assassination. And he's done, he has 90 pages in, now on Greer, and it seems to be a magnificent piece of work. One of the problems that we have to face is the possibility that the Secret Service might have thought that there was a security stripping for a simulated attack on the president, and Vince is following up that story. We proposed that at Fredonia, New York at a third decade conference. Vince explored that at Louisville in a major presentation, and I hope that he will be at Dallas when possibly he will continue that work. I'll see you at 6.
I'm going to continue taking your questions. It is 4:45 now. We're going for about a half an hour till 5:15, so that those of you who want to can get some dinner. I'd like to mention before you all go, I was asked to bring some copies of the original large format paperback of High Treason. I have a few copies with me. If anybody wants them, I'll be glad to autograph them for you later on, okay?
Also, yeah. Last Hurrah has
Well, yeah, Last Hurrah has some copies of the book there too, and other books as well. Okay.
Could you comment on the consistent mortal error since it's similar to this one you just discussed?
I'm sorry?
Mortal error. Could you comment on that?
Oh, yes. Well, I comment on mortal error. There is a character by the name of Bonar Menninger who wrote a book called Mortal Error, which is an absolute ridiculous piece of garbage about a Secret Service agent in a follow-up car standing up, slipping, and shooting the president in the back of the head. It's ludicrous. It's stupid. First of all, what Menninger didn't know is that a film exists showing the Secret Service follow-up car at the moment of the headshot, and that's the Bronson film, which I do have. Nobody stood up in the back of the car. Nobody fired a shot. And nobody lifted up a rifle until well after the president was hit in the head. There's absolute disinformation, and it's easy for him to accuse that Secret Service agent, who unfortunately is dying of cancer now and can't defend himself. His family is terribly distraught. It's a horrible, horrible thing.
A few questions on the back wound. You said, I believe you correct first, that you have 2 wounds in the back. You had like a large one and then a smaller one. You said like the smaller one is more in line with the 6.5 millimeter bullet. Is the larger one a bullet? And if so, what kind of characteristic or what kind of bullet would have made that? And along that same line, how come there only seems to be like 1 bullet entry into the jacket and clothes if the larger is a bullet?
Okay. It's an interesting point. The question is about the 2 apparent wounds in the president's back, what look like wounds. Unfortunately, we can't tell which is which. The lower one that you saw does have an abrasion collar and is the exact size of a Carcano bullet. The higher one could be anything. We don't know what it is. It is not the shape of a bullet wound. It doesn't have the characteristics of a bullet wound. Yet it does, in the photographs, appear to be a hole. It is larger, and it is, again, higher. It's well below the neck, obviously. But I find it extremely interesting that when the House Committee had Ida Dox draw the picture of the president's back, that was inadvertently left out. It's supposed to be a photographic likeness. I don't know what it is. The House Committee photo panel was totally isolated from the medical panel. I did testify before both. I did answer questions to both and gave presentations to both. I was specifically forbidden from dealing with questions of the photographic evidence of the autopsy by Professor Blakey and by the head of the photographic panel.
Which one of those 2 do you think would match up with the wounds in the clothing?
Oh, the lower one. The lower one is the exact spot as the clothing. The answer that the committee had for that was that the clothing may have written up on the president's back. I don't know. Yes.
I did a little digging into the Black Dog Man stuff a couple years ago. I managed to track down these vets. Have you ever spoken to them?
I have not personally spoken to Hugh Betzner. The question relates to the photograph of the Black Dog Man. Hugh Betzner, who took the photograph, a black and white photograph showing the Black Dog Man, and two earlier photographs, which I didn't show, of the president's car on Houston Street and into the turn onto Elm. I've not spoken to him. I understand he's a hard guy to deal with.
Yeah, he was very nervous, and he just told me that he couldn't help me. And I wondered about the negative, because the doctor was going to computer analyze his negative. They couldn't find it, so they had to use the Willis one, which was too blurry to deep blur. And so when I spoke to him, I asked him if he had the negative. He said no. He said Blood Magazine has it. But according to the report in the House volumes, they couldn't find it. That's the negative to use. So they used the Willis one, which is blurrier. Second thing, recently I was watching Phil Kennedy, and from talking, you gave us a little tour on the grass and little last fall. The Black Dog Man is something that occurred to me is probably Gordon Arnold.
Wow, that's a lot to try to repeat. There is a gentleman by the name, have you all seen The Men Who Killed Kennedy? Has anyone not seen The Men Who Killed Kennedy? Okay, a few of you have. Men Who Killed Kennedy, was a documentary that ran 2 hours in England and all around the world in 1988. Very, very fine documentary produced by a gentleman by the name of Nigel Turner. One of the two finest documentaries ever done on the case. And in this documentary, they talked to a gentleman by the name of Gordon Arnold. Gordon Arnold was on the grassy knoll with a movie camera as the president approached. At the time of the first shot from the knoll, Gordon Arnold dove for the ground. He said, problem is, he's still standing there after the throat movement. If indeed Gordon Arnold is the man who appears as the Black Dog Man in the Willis photograph. Several people have disavowed or disbelieved Gordon Arnold's story because of slight inconsistencies. But he does have an extremely good witness, and that's Senator Yarborough, who was riding 2 cars behind the president, who saw Gordon dive to the ground. And he testified about this in The Man Who Killed Kennedy. All I can say is that what Gordon tells is a very interesting story, that the shot was fired so close to his ear that it hurt him, that he was shocked, and he just dropped to the ground. The second part of the story is that after the shooting, somebody came around the fence, held a gun on him and said, were you filming the assassination? He said, yes, and the man said, give me the film. And he opened up the camera and gave him the film and went away. That part does not sound as particularly plausible that an assassin would hang around long enough to grab him. But the man could very well have been in uniform and presented himself as being an official and would have had some kind of cover if other people had gotten up there fast enough. I don't know. We can't prove that Gordon's story is true. We can't prove that it's not true. It has become part of the lore of all of this. Part of that evidence which must be examined with the case is reopened.
Yes, I think it's very interesting, your discussion about Connolly's wound in the wrist, perhaps happening later. I think that can be tied into something Evica has pointed out, spectrographic analysis of that fragment of the wrist, perhaps connected to the head wound Kennedy, which I don't know if you agree with, but that's possible because it happened right away at that time, as you pointed out.
0.6 seconds later. It's very close. Let me just explain what you just said. George Michael Evica has made the hypothesis that indeed the president's head wound had to come from behind, and the Governor Connolly's wrist wound might be connected somehow. This might also relate, I may add, to the possibility of a double headshot, that is, 2 bullets striking at exactly the same moment, or within an 18th of a second of each other. There is some evidence of that. For those of you who have read Josiah Thompson's excellent work, 6 Seconds in Dallas, he hypothesizes a double head hit since the president is thrown slightly forward for a fraction of a second prior to the president being thrown to the rear. If this is true, if there had been some kind of a tangential shot, it would help explain the flap that we see in the front and it could have been slightly delayed going on to hit Governor Connolly's wrist. It is a possibility.
That's why I play devil's advocate then, to say that as Josiah Thompson and you have acknowledged some from back to front shot evidence on that, and that is the only thing that I see when I see this career film. Now, for a long time, I was like everyone else and thought that because the head went back, that meant it came from the grassy knoll. But I've been seeing it before and looking at Alvarez's book and his explanation for that jet effect, for want of a better term. And I see that jet effect actually happen. I see exit wound, which is bigger, come from the temple area, which in turn is a force in Newtonian physics, which forces that head back and to the left because of the tangential boom from the top of the head back to the front temple right area, which is, as you mentioned, he's turning a little bit towards Jackson to the left, and Oswald is a little bit more to the back as Elm Street curves a diagonal away from the depository, which allows that tangential shot and the exit wound to the right. I'd like to comment.
Yeah, well, Luke, that's a very long question to try to repeat. Basically, there was a physicist by the name of Louis Alvarez, who basically was an apologist for the Warren Commission for several years. He has now passed away. Louis Alvarez made two notable contributions to this case. One extremely valuable, one absolutely useless. The first one is the jiggle effect. He noted that when a shot occurs on the Zapruder film, that Zapruder responds to it, he jumps to it. There is a jiggle, a noticeable jiggle, after the first splice, where the first shot was fired. There is a gigantic jiggle at 3:18, five frames, or 1/3 of a second after the headshot. So that was a very good contribution. But he also came up with an absolutely ridiculous theory called the jet effect. And the jet effect theory is that as the president was struck in the head, the bullet that struck the head created so much force that as it exited, it allowed the brain to fly out and therefore make the head go back to the source of the bullet. It's stupid. It makes no sense. First of all, it would have to counteract the transfer of momentum initially. Okay? That's the first step. The most we can hope for is a neutral effect, where the force going in would equal the force going out, and it would neutralize. The second thing is, well, we're seeing the majority of the so-called jet trail go straight up, which means the president would be driven downward.
It goes straight up and partly forward.
But it also goes to the rear as well. The House committee did computer enhancement of the Zapruder frame 313 and after that, and found a great many fragments driven downward into the rear.
I see that happening from 314 on, because his head takes some of that back as it goes back. And I think that's what causes the motorcycle man to be heavy debris and projecting go out on the trunk and all of this. Yes, there was debris that went back.
Exactly.
Because the head going back is still spewing debris.
Well,
I see in the Zapruder.
Well, then we also have the fact that both the Zapruder and Nix films show that volcanic open area immediately after the headshot to the rear, which is exactly what every one of the doctors saw.
Mr. Groden, that I saw was hair. I didn't see the volcanic stuff. I saw...
Well, the doctors did. They were there. You weren't.
I saw...
We're going to be talking about, this is just, we get things rolling, we're going to be talking about Freedom of Information Act, the assassination files, the hearings, and also the MLK inquest. I guess we can always say a funny thing happened to me on the way to the National Archives or FBI files. But, I think Jim will agree with this. one of the best ways to get valuable paper out, flush the paper out, but send it to the wrong person, is to, for a number of years, deny the spectrographic materials to Harold Weisberg. Right? The men I thought would be most capable of discussing them, and then send them to me. So I had to do 24 months of work to find out what the hell they meant. And it's an effective way to both release and simultaneously stop up the investigation while the person to whom you release them learns something about the nature of the paper that they sent.
I'm going to come up after you just talk.
Okay.
Thanks.
I want to welcome you again to the Midwest Symposium on the Assassination of John F. Kennedy. We are again beholden to Douglas Carlson, who was energized by Jerry Rose's call for activism out of the third decade research journal dedicated to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Remember, tomorrow, the emergency rooms at Parkland with Dr. Charles Crenshaw, Dr. Cyril Watt on the Kennedy autopsies, John Newman on Vietnam and JFK, and Craig Zerbel and LBJ. But now, first, we're going to hear from Jim Lesar. Jim Lesar is a Washington, D.C. lawyer specializing in Freedom of Information Act litigation. Over the past 20 years, he has litigated more than 90 lawsuits for records pertaining to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He is also president of the Assassination Archives and Research Center, a nonprofit organization. After our yearly meeting, we had a delightful dinner party at his home just recently. The Assassination Archives and Research Center, we have both organizations sign-up sheets for you outside. An organization dedicated to obtaining, preserving, and disseminating information on political assassinations. Jim Lesar.
Good evening. Just to give you a brief sketch of what I'm going to talk about this evening, I will talk first about a bit of the history of Kennedy assassination records, then go into the entanglement of the Freedom of Information Act and the Kennedy assassination, and lastly come around to the current pending proposals to release records that are now being considered by Congress. After I finish speaking on these topics, we'll open it for questions from the audience. It's popularly believed that the Warren Commission urged that its materials be sealed and kept from the public until the year 2039. This belief is wrong. To the contrary, the Warren Commission never urged that its materials be kept secret to the year 2039 or any other year. In fact, Chief Justice Warren himself, speaking for the Commission, stated that it, quote, had no desire to restrict public access to any of its working papers except those classified by other agencies. The history of the records of the Warren Commission begins, of course, with the publication of the report in September of '64 and the release of the 26 volumes of supporting hearings and evidence in October '64. The Warren Commission published its volumes over the objections of Warren Commission member Alan Dulles, who thought that only a couple of professors would bother to read them. Upon its demise, the commission turned over 300 cubic feet of records, its working files, to the National Archives. Controversy over these records began when it was disclosed in December of 1964 that the archives planned to keep them secret for 75 years. At that time, this 75-year period, which is the basis for the myth that the Warren Commission intended to keep its records secret until the year 2039, that was the archives' rule for all historic investigations, not just the papers pertaining to the Warren Commission. What happened next is a rare and graphic example of the ability of one person who cares to make a difference. The protest which changed national policy came not from a Warren Commission critic, but from Robert H.L. Jackson, the mayor of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. On January 4, 1965, Mayor Johnson penned a short but eloquent protest letter to President Lyndon Baines Johnson, stating that he had read and believed the Warren Report. He expressed his chagrin that, quote, "you would permit a government agency to dictate to you what will be done with testimony and exhibits for the next 75 years. Invoking President Johnson's oft-declared belief in the public's right to know, the mayor chided the president for permitting, quote, a 75-year cloak of secrecy to fall over the facts involved in the Kennedy assassination. He concluded with a devastatingly direct observation. If there is true justification for withholding from the public the facts of one of the most tragic events of our time, it is also incumbent upon our national leadership to make clear why. It is a point which, more than a quarter of a century later, needs to be stressed again. The White House bucked Mayor Johnson's letter to the archives, requesting that it provide a background memo on the subject of public disclosure of Warren Commission materials, and a suggested reply to Mayor Johnson. A week later, the archives produced a bureaucratic response justifying the 75-year rule, which it had imposed on investigative materials, quote, at the request of other agencies. Its suggested letter to Mayor Johnson assured him that the Commission's report of its findings and conclusions and the 26 volumes of its supporting evidence, quote, contain the relevant facts concerning the assassination of President Kennedy. No pertinent facts have been withheld. Mayor Johnson's eloquent protest notwithstanding, the nation's official archivists continue to favor a good, deep memory hole. The archive's position smacked more of politics than a concern for historical knowledge. Before the archives had even inventoried the Warren Commission's holdings, much less evaluated the evidence, it had issued a ringing endorsement of the Commission's findings and conclusions. At the White House, the archives' proposed response to Mayor Johnson fell into the hands of McGeorge Bundy, special assistant to President Johnson. Bundy declined to endorse the archives' Stonewall tactics. On January the 18th, 1965, he sent a memorandum to the acting Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, which damned the archives' memorandum with faint praise, saying that while it seemed to him to have some merit, he thought that, quote, in view of the very special nature of the Warren Commission investigation and the desirability of the fullest possible disclosure of all the findings, a further study should be made of the feasibility and advisability of making an exception to the normal 75-year rule in this particular case. Bundy asked Attorney General Katzenbach to direct the Justice Department, in consultation with other appropriate agencies, to coordinate this study He specifically requested that the study include, but not necessarily be limited to, such questions as A, what alternatives are there to the 75-year procedure which would meet the aim of the fullest possible disclosure, and at the same time not violate national security, the national security of, or the dictates of good sense. For example, can some or most of the material be released in 2 years, 5 years? Can certain categories of the public, e.g. scholars, receive special treatment? How does the Warren Commission view this problem, particularly the Chief Justice and Lee Rankin? On April 5, 1965, Chief Justice Warren answered for the Commission. He informed Attorney General Katzenbach that the Commission had carefully considered the issue before it had delivered its papers to the National Archives. Quote, it wished them to be held there for the benefit of the American people. At that time, Warren wrote, the Commission decided that it was in the best interest of all concerned that the policy relating to the Commission's records provide for the fullest possible disclosure. The Chief Justice noted 2 possible impediments to disclosure. 1, the Commission's records contained investigative materials which were classified by the originating agencies, quote, to protect the security of the United States. 2, among these materials were, quote, were numerous items which inhered serious potential for character assassination and other misuse to the injury of innocent people. With respect to classified materials, the Commission had concluded that it did not have either the authority or the necessary information to determine the technical questions as to to which of the classified materials could be released without injury to the security of the country. It decided that this decision, quote, must of necessity be left with the originating agencies and the Attorney General. It also concluded that these agencies and the Attorney General could best determine what safeguards were necessary to protect innocent persons in the release of defamatory materials. Despite these caveats, Chief Justice Warren stressed that the Commission, quote, assumed that all the determinations by the agencies and the Attorney General would be made in recognition of the overriding consideration of the fullest possible disclosure. Just in case the Attorney General didn't get his drift, Warren expressed once again the Commission's attitude towards, quote, full disclosure of its records. The Commission has no desire to restrict public access to any of its working papers except those classified by other agencies. In addition to the views of the Warren Commission, the Justice Department also surveyed 8 agencies which had provided records to the Commission. The Justice Department's survey elicited a variety of responses, but most of the agencies indicated that they were not wedded to the 75-year rule and were willing to make significant disclosures relatively soon. One agency stood in glaring contrast to all the rest. The CIA stated flatly that the 75-year rule should apply, but even the passage of 75 years would not necessarily bring an end to the need for secrecy. All the CIA agreed to do at the end of 75 years was to conduct a review to see if the secrecy could then be lifted. On April 13, 1965, the Attorney General submitted the results of his study of the availability of Warren Commission records to McGeorge Bundy. Katzenbach stated that based on the view of the Commission and the recommendations of the federal agencies involved, the Justice Department believed that there should be some modification of the normal procedures of the National Archives. He then set forth some guidelines which should govern the availability of the Commission's records. On April 19, 1965, McGeorge Bundy notified the Attorney General that these guidelines had been approved, and he instructed Katzenbach, in coordination with the archives, to conduct and complete a review of the Commission's records in accordance with these guidelines by September 1, 1965. The Justice Department guidelines provided that certain categories of information in the Warren Commission files need not be disclosed, including, for example, information which might reveal the identity of confidential sources or the nature of confidential methods of acquiring information, lead to incorrect identification of sources of information and thereby embarrass the individuals or the agency involved, be a source of embarrassment to innocent persons, or be detrimental to the administration and enforcement of the laws and regulations of the United States and its agencies. Although security classifications, quote, would be respected, the classifying agency should consider whether the classification can be eliminated or graded down consistently with the national security. Even where one of the listed reasons for non-disclosure applied, the agency involved was to weigh such reason against the overriding consideration of the fullest possible disclosure in determining whether or not to authorize disclosure. All materials not made available to the public, all material not made available to the public was to be reviewed by the agency concerned 5 years and 10 years after the initial examination had been completed. Under these guidelines, the National Archives proceeded to release approximately 98% of the Warren Commission records. In 1966, on July 4, 1966, Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act. The law did not become effective until the following year, 1967. Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the law. The law had been drafted largely by a man who later became a leading Warren Commission critic, Bernard Bud Fensterwald, Jr. In the first few years, there were very few lawsuits filed under the Freedom of Information Act by anyone. In 1969, Bud Fensterwald left his employment on the Hill to enter private practice of law and to set up an organization called the Committee to Investigate Assassinations. Harold Weisberg, one of the early critics of the Warren Commission, urged Bud to file Freedom of Information Act requests, or to file suit on some Freedom of Information Act requests that Weisberg had submitted on various subjects, the King assassination and President Kennedy's assassination. One of the first and most important was Weisberg's suit for the spectrographic analyses performed on items of evidence in the assassination of President Kennedy. That lawsuit was filed in 1970 after Weisberg was unable to get any response from the Department of Justice. Bud Fensterwald represented Weisberg, and I just out of law school to assist him in the case. The case came before Judge John Sirica, who later became famous as the judge who broke open the Watergate scandal, and broke it open because James McCord, represented by Bud Fensterwald, wrote him a letter complaining that there was illegal and improper activity that had been concealed from the court, including perjured testimony. Judge Sirica at this time, at the time the Spectro suit first came before him, was not yet famous as the hero of Watergate. He was better known at that time as Maximum John for his habit of sentencing criminal violators to the maximum possible prison term. The FBI reacted very strongly to to the request for the spectrographic analysis. They submitted an affidavit to the court which listed a sort of catalog of horror that would befall the Department of Justice if the request for these test results were granted. The files of the FBI would be opened, all kinds of calamities would befall the FBI. They wouldn't be able to operate anymore. The Assistant Attorney General who had the case got up in front of Judge Sirica and argued that the Attorney General had determined that the national interest of the United States required that the spectrographic analyses not be disclosed. Judge Sirica listened to that and banged his gavel and said, "Case dismissed." We had lost the first round. We appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. The Court of Appeals took its time, almost 2 years before it handed down a decision, a 2-to-1 decision in our favor, remanding the case back to Judge Sirica for further proceedings. But there was a dissent by Senior Circuit Judge John Danaher, a rather curious dissent in which the judge referred to Freedom of Information Act requesters as rummaging writers and seemed to refer to Weisberg as some party off the street, and said that the Freedom of Information Act as it is presently constituted forfends against plaintiffs' proposed further inquiry into the assassination of President Kennedy. And then he concluded his opinion in capital letters, requiescat in pace, rest in peace. We were not content to let the case rest in peace, so we, at that point we had won a 2-to-1 victory, notwithstanding Judge Danaher's dissent. But the government, the Justice Department, moved for a rehearing en banc in front of the full court. And the full court agreed, rather surprisingly, to hear the case. And this time there was a new decision. And Judge Danaher was no longer the sole dissent. He was the author of the majority opinion. The sole dissent came from the Chief Judge, Judge David Bazelon, and we lost by a 9-to-1 vote. We appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denied certiorari, with only Justice William O. Douglas voting to hear the case. However, the case had set a very atrocious precedent under the Freedom of Information Act. It had eviscerated the act. The ruling, in essence, was that any time a government agency, a government law enforcement agency, particularly the FBI, asserts that the records requested are part of a law enforcement file, it doesn't have to release it. It rendered the records of the FBI and other law enforcement agencies inaccessible to the Freedom of Information Act. In the meantime, the Supreme Court had decided a question under the Freedom of Information Act, Exemption 1, which deals with national security. In the case of Environmental Protection Agency versus Mink, Mink being Patsy Mink, the delegate from the Congresswoman from Hawaii. And Congress, the Supreme Court had said in that case, in a decision very parallel to the Weisberg case, that it didn't matter whether the government had lied about the national security or what the records allegedly withheld under the guise of national security were. If the government said that it involved national security, that was the end of the matter. Well, Congress didn't like that decision, and soon in 1974 there was an amendment to, there was a proposal to amend Exemption 1. And during the discussion on the floor of the Senate regarding Exemption 1, Senator Hart of Michigan moved to amend Exemption 7. Exemption 7 was the exemption under which the FBI had denied Weisberg the spectrographic analysis. Senator Kennedy rose to the floor to ask Senator Hart whether or not his amendment to Exemption 7 would override several decisions of the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, including the Weisberg decision. Senator Hart said yes, it would, and the Senate then voted to amend Exemption 7 to override the Weisberg case. So we had prevailed on Congress to amend Exemption 7, and the case that did it was a case involving Kennedy assassination records. On the day that the new Freedom of Information Act, the amended Freedom of Information Act, became effective, February 19, 1975, we went back into court, refiling the spectrographic suit with an additional request for neutron activation analysis. Despite the previous 4 years of history and the fact that Congress had amended the law to accommodate our request, to make it possible for people to get the kind of information that we were seeking, the FBI continued to resist disclosure. It claimed that it produced, it coughed up a few documents, but claimed that it really didn't have very much, and that there were some documents were missing, some had been destroyed, some of the samples had been destroyed. And that was the end of it. And the district court judge agreed with the FBI that we didn't have any case and dismissed us. We went back to the Court of Appeals. And this time the issue was whether or not we were to be allowed to take depositions of FBI agents to determine what tests had been conducted, what records had been created, where the records were located, whether or not records had been destroyed, questions of that nature. We won in the Court of Appeals, setting an important precedent that requesters in Freedom of Information Act cases in appropriate circumstances are entitled to take a discovery to establish the existence or non-existence of records, and whether or not the agency had conducted an adequate search for those records. When we got back, we did get additional records, although not without additional struggle. A second case that Weisberg brought prior to the amendment of the Freedom of Information Act in 1974 is also worth mentioning. Gerald Ford had undergone confirmation hearings to become vice president, and he had given some testimony. The issue had come up about some remarks in his book, in which he recounted some of the things that had happened at a Warren Commission executive session transcript. When this came to our attention, I knew that Weisberg had requested the Warren Commission executive session transcripts. and had been refused them on the grounds that they were classified in the interest of national security. So I suggested that if Ford could print materials from those transcripts, and if he had testified, as he did, that he had not revealed classified information, then Weisberg ought to be able to get the transcripts as well. So we filed suit against the National Archives under the Freedom of Information Act for the January 27, 1964 Warren Commission executive session, the one that Ford had quoted in his book, and the one which involved the session at which the Warren Commission had discussed extensively whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was an informant for the FBI. The National Archives claimed that the transcript was classified. We submitted evidence showing that all of the Warren Commission's executive session and the government submitted an affidavit by former Solicitor General and Warren Commission General Counsel J. Rankin, stating that the transcripts were classified for reasons of national security. We countered by submitting detailed documents and evidence showing that all of the transcripts, regardless of content, had been stamped classified by the court reporter before the Warren Commission ever saw them, routinely. The district court judge ruled that the government had not supported its Exemption 1 claim, its national security claim, but they had also invoked the law enforcement exemption, and he found that the transcript had been compiled for law enforcement purposes, even though it had never been made available to any law enforcement agency, a fact that we established on discovery in the case. Before we could appeal that, this development occurred, and so he granted, the judge, Gerhard Gazelle, granted summary judgment to the National Archives, and we were about to appeal that case for the first time, when suddenly the National Archives forked it over, having won the case in front of the district court. They decided to disclose it, and that transcript became the content of Weisberg's whitewash report on that executive session transcript. And then, as a result of that, we got a second, I think even more revealing transcript, the transcript of the Warren Commission's January 22nd, 1964 executive session, in which the commission members called into emergency executive session by Chief Justice Warren. This first discussed the rumor that Oswald was a government informant, and during that transcript revealed that they felt that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had boxed them into a corner by leaking to the press the FBI's conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald alone had assassinated the president. The FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had confronted the Warren Commission with a dilemma. Either the commission went along with Hoover's finding that Oswald alone was guilty, or they had to take Hoover on head-on. They had to investigate the head of the FBI himself. They talked about it. They were frightened, clearly from the transcript, of the implications of the fact that without running out all kinds of leads, as they put it, Hoover was declaring that Oswald was the lone assassin, and that it was evident that he would like to have us fold up and quit. And they said they had to investigate Hoover. But in the end, they lacked the courage to do so and did not investigate Hoover. So that was one of the result of a very important lawsuit. We got two extremely important and revealing transcripts of the Warren Commission's internal deliberations. There were many other important lawsuits filed under the Freedom of Information Act for JFK assassination materials in the late 1970s. Weisberg sought, for example, the Dallas and New Orleans field office files on the Kennedy assassination. Up to that time, the FBI had routinely claimed that it could not search for particular records or documents without doing a page-by-page search of its entire headquarters file, because it didn't have any index to them. During the course of this lawsuit, we learned that while FBI headquarters might not have an index, the Dallas field office had an index consisting of 48,000 3x5 cards. And as a result of that suit, once we forced them to admit to that, we got that index. It's the AARC, the Assassination Archives and Research Center, now has a copy of that index, together with a cross-reference index, which enables you to look up the names of people in the Dallas field office index and then go to the cross-reference index and find where the material is in the headquarters file. After the House Select Committee concluded its proceedings, a client of mine, Mark Allen, filed two lawsuits of gargantuan proportions. One for all of the records that the Department of Defense and the CIA had made available to the House Select Committee on assassinations. In the case of the CIA, that amounted to 300,000 pages of documents. Second, a companion lawsuit was brought against the FBI for all of the records that the FBI had made available to the House Select Committee on assassinations. That amounted, exclusive of the FBI's headquarters files, which are about 100,000 pages, that amounted to 320,000 pages. The first 3 years of each of those two lawsuits was consumed in trying to beat down the government's 4 defenses.
Defenses against disclosure. Each one of the 4 defenses, had they been upheld by the court, would have deprived us from obtaining any records at all. The government claimed that the records that we were seeking were not agency records, that they were congressional records, and therefore we couldn't get them because the Freedom of Information Act only entitles you to access to agency records. The clerk of the House of Representatives jumped into the lawsuit and claimed that all the records were protected by the speech or debate clause of the United States Constitution. The agencies, the FBI, also claimed that they were exempt under Exemption 5, which protects intra-agency communications and deliberations. And then finally, the government said that even if none of these exemption claims applies, you can't have the documents because you can't pay for them. It'll cost you $32,000 to get the FBI records and 10 cents a page for all the CIA records, and you haven't put up the money, so you can't get them. Well, we beat down all the defenses, and we got a fee waiver for all the documents. And in 1984, the CIA and the FBI began to process the records. The FBI, unfortunately, by this time, the Reagan and Bush administrations had begun, the Reagan administration at that point had begun to negate the impact of the 1974 amendments, which had opened the Freedom of Information Act up. And it became harder and harder to get materials, so that over the past 11 years, in processing the 320,000 pages of FBI documents, the FBI has only released 88,000 pages. It's withheld most of the documents under one claim of exemption or another. The CIA has been even more restrictive, releasing probably no more than 2% of all of the records, and most of those were copies of newspaper clippings or documents that had previously been released. Both cases are still pending and will probably be going on for several more years, particularly now because of the new legislation, which I think will be enacted sometime this summer or this fall. That legislation is vitally important precisely because the Freedom of Information Act has failed to release most or many of the documents that are relevant to a study of the Kennedy assassination. The new legislation contemplates the appointment of an Assassination Materials Review Board. The initial bills introduced into the Senate and the House by Senator Boren and Congressman Stokes, respectively, contemplated appointment of the board by the Special Judicial Panel, which appoints special prosecutors. That has now been changed. Each House has put forth a substitute proposal that would have the President of the United States appoint the review board. Clearly, this is not desirable. Bush has a direct conflict of interest, among other things, because of his tenure as director of the CIA, and director of the CIA at a time when the Church Committee was holding its hearings, and he has, according to Carl Bernstein, Bush and Colby interfered in the Church Committee and diffused the Church Committee's probe into the CIA's use of journalists. And there are other reasons why Bush should not be involved in making the selection. The problem is that arguments against Bush being the person who would appoint the board fall on deaf ears, because the Senate, and in particular Senator Carl Levin, it's come time for the reauthorization of the special prosecutor legislation, and Levin is worried that extension of this principle of having the Special Judicial Panel appoint special commissions and special prosecutors undercuts the reauthorization of the special prosecutor legislation. So both houses have now made the appointment of the board by the President of the United States, and I think that it is likely that the bill will be enacted in that form. Both houses now have 5 members who will be on the board. Initially, the legislation would have excluded anyone who had been involved in prior investigation of President Kennedy's assassination from being appointed to the board. That has now been changed, and only those who were involved in an official prior investigation will be excluded. The House and the Senate versions, current versions, differ as to the powers of the board. The House version has relegated the Assassination Materials Review Board to a role essentially as an advisory committee that would make recommendations on the release of records to the National Archives. The Senate version is much stronger on this point and on many other points, and would have the Assassination Review Board make determinations as to whether or not assassination materials would be disclosed. The legislation contains several grounds for postponing disclosure. One of the conceptual differences between the legislation and the Freedom of Information Act is that under the Freedom of Information Act, there are 9 exemptions from disclosure, and once a government agency demonstrates that it's entitled to exemption, the material is exempt. Under the proposed legislation, there is no exemption for material, but the disclosure of material can be postponed if it meets certain criteria. The criteria for postponement of disclosure are much more liberal in terms of disclosure than the Freedom of Information Act exemptions, so that much more material should be released than under the Freedom of Information Act. Moreover, the Senate version, at least, requires agencies to review every year the material for which disclosure has been postponed and make a new determination as to whether or not it will continue to be postponed. The President of the United States can determine that the disclosure of materials may be postponed, but he cannot delegate that. He will have to make that decision on his own. He will have to publish it in the Federal Register, so that presumably the amount of material, and he's under a very specific time limit. He has only, in the Senate version, I think it's 14 days to make the decision whether or not to postpone disclosure. The impact of this is to put the President in the position of only being able to deal with the more important matters, and presumably the bulk of the material will come out. I don't think that all of it is going to come out by any means. There are still grounds for withholding information that I think are too broad, but it's a vast improvement over the current condition of the Freedom of Information Act, and a lot more material should be released. The Senate version also has a provision that there cannot be any destruction or alteration of records. It has a provision allowing for the appointment of advisory committees that would assist the review board in its work. Review board will be in existence for 2 years, an initial period of 2 years. The members of the review board can vote to extend their life for one additional year if they've not completed their work within the first 2 years. A major problem is how to define what constitutes an assassination record. The Senate version, I think, is better than the House version, is quite a bit broader than the House version, although it has been weakened over its original definition. But it's still quite broad, and it will apply to any record that has been that is related to the president, to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, that was created or made available for use by, obtained by, or otherwise came into the possession of the Warren Commission, the Rockefeller Commission, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, that's the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, any presidential library, any executive agency, any independent agency, any other office of the federal government, including the executive office of the presidency, that's the White House, and any state or local law enforcement office that provided support or assistance or performed work in connection with a federal inquiry into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The only exclusion, both in the Senate and the House bills, from that list of materials that would be included within the scope of the term are the autopsy records. Those are specifically excluded. That's a point to which I objected in my testimony to the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee on May the 12th of this year. But it may be a moot point because there is currently a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act to force the archives to release the autopsy materials to a FOIA requester. That's the broad outline of the legislation. I think it's very significantly is going to increase the amount of material available very significantly, but there are still some hard fights to be fought. In recent years, under the Freedom of Information Act, the CIA has maintained adamantly that the need to keep certain kind of materials secret, sources and methods, stretches beyond the present geological epoch into all eternity. Under the CIA's view of things, expressed in affidavits to the courts, most of the information pertinent to the JFK assassination and other subjects as well will never see the light of day, ever. As the lyrics of a popular song say, longer than forever is a long, long time. It's obvious that secrecy on that scale is an unjustifiable assault on democratic accountability and an affront to the birthright of the American people to know their own history. I'm hopeful that the legislation now before Congress will make substantial inroads on the ability of the CIA to continue to withhold information. If there are any questions, yes.
We know that Blakey and Stokes are going to continue their destructive tactics. Drag it out as long as they can, water it down as much as they can. In the Senate, I agree here on TV, Senator Green, Ohio,
Well, the Senate Governmental Affairs panel, I think, supports the legislation. Senator Glenn and Senator Boren are key people who are carrying the ball.
Senator Boren is representing state.
Yes.
In the House of Representatives,
The House Intelligence Committee, yes.
And they're part of that Southwest group that's pretty conservative, and too far removed from some of the Texas friends.
Well, I can only report that at his press conference, at which I attended when he announced his introduction of the legislation, Senator Boren expressed the hope that the legislation would result in the release of 99.99999% of the material. Now, I think that it's unlikely that anything like that will approach, that they will be able to do that, but that he's sort of stuck in the position of having said very forthrightly and very publicly that he expects virtually everything to come out.
Second question, you're currently re-showing the Turner five-part series on the Part 2 has to do with the so-called Portugal Connection, Christian David, non-critical France. I read recently where you're going to the Groden brand and introducing the prisoners. Can you really comment on your findings?
Well, I don't really have any findings. I did speak with Christian David. I interviewed him up in. That's incorrect. I did not interview him. I was present at an interview of him by Steve Revell, which took place in the Metropolitan Correctional Institute when we managed to temporarily halt David's extradition back to France. We got a judge to issue what year was it? Everything sort of becomes a blur after a while. It's sometime in the mid-'80s, 84, 85, sometime in there. We got a judge to issue a temporary restraining order restraining the government from extraditing him to France. They put him on a plane in Kansas, and when the plane landed in New York, by that time the judge had issued the order, and they took him off the plane in New York and put him in the Metropolitan Correctional Institute for a couple of days. Yes?
Mr. Lesar, the committee to investigate assassination was one of the early groups that compiled detailed records. And many of the records, certainly after 1973 and turned over to Georgetown University. Great disputes about it because Georgetown University was very close to CIA. Principal died last year. His obituary did become the suspicion of some that he was one faction of CIA.
I don't think the obituaries went quite that far, although there may have been some suggestion of that. My comment is that I simply don't believe the allegations. I'm aware that there is conflicting evidence and that some people have strong beliefs about it. But of my own knowledge, I don't think that Bud was CIA.
Why were all the records turned over to Georgetown University?
Well, first of all, all of the records were not turned over to Georgetown University. Well, that was 1973. I don't know what proportion of the records it was at that time. I don't think it was even a majority or even a very substantial number of them. The Assassination archives, which I now head as a result of Bud's death, has probably 1 million pages of records. I doubt that the volume of those donated to Georgetown could be more than a couple of thousand pages, to my recollection. I was not really involved in that, but I did have some knowledge of it.
Follow-up question. James Earl Ray and others that know him contend that while Pensacola was represented, and instead of bringing out conspiracy and involved with that some of the ones that Pensacola and others is something deeper into the lives. What do you think of that?
Sour grapes. Bud Fensterwald, out of his own pocket, put tens of thousands of dollars into the James Earl Ray defense. He put well in excess of $100,000 out of his own pocket into the Committee to Investigate Assassinations. From 1985 until his death in 1992, he spent some $50,000 to $60,000 a year out of his own pocket to establish and run the assassination archives. I don't know of any other individual in the country that contributed that much to the attempt to learn about the various political assassinations in this country. Moreover, the amount of money that he poured into these efforts is minor compared to the amount of time and attention that he gave to a great number of people and a great number of projects over the years. He was extraordinarily generous with both his time and his money.
Why have you sent me to the conference for the assassination researchers from all over the world? Did you forbid any discussion, any links between JFK, Dallas, and Margaret, he having been the attorney for James McCord?
Yes, he was the attorney for James McCord, and I think it's important, very important to note that the country might never have learned the truth about Watergate and about Nixon if it had not been for Bud Fensterwald's heroic efforts to open that case up. James McCord, at that time, was in jail and had been found guilty, and he was trying desperately to remove the attorneys who then represented him, F. Lee Bailey and Gerald Alch, and to find some way of telling the court that a fraud had been perpetrated upon it and that perjured testimony had been given. It's my understanding from the facts that are known to me secondhand that an intermediary came to Bud and suggested that James McCord would be willing to talk if a way could be found to get him out on bail. It's my understanding also that Bud went to the Democratic National Committee to try to get them to put up the bail money, that they refused him, and that Bud pledged his own house as collateral to get McCord out on jail. Then Bud took McCord's letter and sent it to Judge Sirica, and the rest is history. I suggest that that speaks far more eloquently about Bud's real role than any of your suspicions.
Yes, we're going to have to go on. Hold on.
Yeah, Jim, I'd like to finish with you my question about the credibility of Christian David. Are you saying your only meeting with him was in that session here in this country before he was to be flown to France?
Pardon, am I saying that that was my only meeting with him?
Yes.
No, I'm not saying that.
Then would you care to comment on his credibility, the story that's being told with regard to him by Steve Revell on this current series?
I think we're getting rather far afield from the subject of my talk.
I'll see you later. I'll see you later.
Jim, I've got some questions on the filings. Where would these records be? They're released. Where would they be?
Where would the records subject to the...
Once you get them, these say 600,000, 700,000 pages. They're now released. Where would I go to look for them?
Well, under the legislation, the records may be transferred. Those that to which there is no objection to disclosing will be transferred to the National Archives, and you can obtain them there. You will probably also be able to get them at the agencies.
At the agencies themselves.
As well.
Do the agencies have reading rooms where these documents could be read rather than take them out?
Some do, some don't. The FBI does have a reading room, and they have already put 250,000 pages on the Kennedy assassination in their reading room.
Do the federal depository libraries, would they store them in any way around the United States?
There are the 1,400 federal depository libraries. The pending legislation gives the National Archives the authority to reprint those that it considers should be published in some form, and gives it authority to distribute those to the 1,400 federal depository libraries.
Good. We were talking about ultimately if the Assassination Archives and Research Center could afford it to get those records and scan them, and you have since said scanning would be impossible. Have you thought of, I think you have thought about microfiche and the possibility of...
Well, yeah, one project that we're working on now is to identify core JFK assassination documents, and we would then index and annotate them, organize them according to subject matter, and have them published on microfiche, yes.
Okay, and the Assassination Archives and Research Center is now thinking about putting out a regular newsletter, and that newsletter then would contain that kind of information for researchers?
Yes.
Great. Another question.
One that really intrigues me, because I was able to determine the titles, was a letter from Earl Ruby to the Warren Commission. Would that be just because it's a personal thing, a letter from Earl Ruby?
Most likely it would be for reasons of personal privacy, yes.
Right. Okay, thanks a lot. Because there's only 23 or 24, like we keep hearing all these documents that are still not available, and presumably what we're talking about is mostly house assassination documents and so forth?
Well, you're talking about a number of different kinds of documents. First, you're talking about the House Select Committee documents, and that probably is somewhere in the range of between 500,000 and 600,000 pages of documents. We don't know for sure because there is some discrepancy in the various figures that have been given as to the number of boxes that were transferred to the National Archives, and in addition, we don't know whether the boxes are all full or partially empty, and we don't know how many of the boxes relate to the Martin Luther King assassination as opposed to the JFK assassination.
Okay, another question up here, Jim.
Yeah, Jim, you sent out a letter maybe a year ago or so expressing concern about the financial health of the ARC. Could you tell us how that's going right now, or maybe make a plea for funds or whatever?
We're still in poor financial shape, but we're better off than we were this time last summer. We have enough money on hand at the moment to stay in existence for another 4 months. Last summer, we didn't have any money at all. So we're somewhat better off, but we're still hurting, and we're hurting because we don't have enough money to pay full-time people to assist in running the archive, so that we're not able to keep the archive open on all hours of the day.
Is there a connection between Dallas and Watergate?
To my personal knowledge, no. I really can't answer it. I have not looked at it, and I don't know one way or the other.
Jim, we have 2 more questions.
What, if anything, can we do before, help?
Can you hold on for just a minute?
Okay, Jim, why could you just give us a bit of background on why the reauthorization of the special prosecutor legislation may undercut the Bush conflict of interest prohibition on the appointments for the assassination of people?
Yeah, the problem is essentially a political one. The special prosecutor law is under attack by Republicans, and the Bush administration in particular They want to get rid of it, frankly. They're making very vociferous complaints about the amount of money that it has cost for Prosecutor Walsh to conduct the Iran-Contra probe. And they don't like the law, they don't want it. And the fear of those who support special prosecutor legislation is that if you expand this device of having a special judicial panel appoint someone to carry out the provisions of a particular law, that you're going to undercut your support for renewal of the special prosecutor legislation.
Okay, another question here. Do I understand correctly that the latest legislation, proposed legislation, only deals with review and release of documents that have already been submitted to an investigation, and therefore if there's some document that someone comes across or hypothesizes about that's never been released to anyone, but that's not covered by this?
No, that my reading of the Senate bill is that it's quite different than the House bill. You're correct that the House bill, you only get what the federal agencies got during their prior investigations. I read the Senate, the latest Senate bill, which was just passed by the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee 2 days ago. I read that as saying that if there is a document in the possession of or that was created or obtained by any one of the federal government agencies listed or congressional committees or executive commissions that are listed in that provision, that document, if it relates to the assassination of the President Kennedy, will be an assassination record regardless of whether or not it was created or obtained in connection with a particular investigation. That's the way I read that provision, and one of the reasons why I favor the Senate bill over the House bill.
Question down here, Jim. One's a yes or no question tied into that one, and then the other one's a pretty simple one. Would the Operation Mongoose files qualify under what we just discussed?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it.
Okay. He's asking about what could be called under a number of things like Zia rifle or Operation Mongoose. The operations against Fidel Castro run by the Office of Security, etc. On the assumption that some of those or all of those, the House Select Committee on Assassinations examined, would they be also in those boxes?
Well, first they would be if the House examined them, yes. We don't know whether the extent to which the House examined them. The House requested a lot of materials. One problem is that Professor Blakey was obsessively concerned with the organized crime angle, and it's clear that most of the FBI records requested by the House Select Committee relate to organized crime figures. It's not clear because the CIA has withheld so much. We don't know to what extent that concern permeated the request to the CIA. Logically, I would expect it to be much less true of the CIA because the CIA had far fewer records on organized crime figures than the FBI. In addition, there were certainly substantial numbers of requests by the House Select Committee for Cuban exile organizations and persons. The CIA had volumes of materials on those, so there's certainly those would be within the request. I would expect that the House Select Committee did ask for the Mongoose materials and the materials that the Church Committee requested. In addition, because the Church Committee is one of the organizations mentioned in the list of organizations of agencies and commissions in the bill covered, it would be independently covered because they are Church Committee records. To the extent that either the agency or the review board concludes that the Church Committee records are records pertaining to the assassination of Kennedy, they would be available under the Act, and I think it would be very difficult
to make out a case that the mongoose records are not assassination records.
And the last thing is, what can we do now to like help you? I mean, is there anything we can do? I mean, other than write a congressman, is there anything else we can do?
To help with the legislation?
Yeah, to help you or the cause, or to espouse, get things out.
Well, you can write the congressional committees and express your opinion. At this point, the legislation, I think, is pretty far along. There's not much time left to do anything at this point, except to express a view that the definition of assassination records should be as broad as possible, and that the grounds for postponement of disclosure should be as narrow as possible.
I'd like to bring up now John Judge. John, are you in the audience?
Yes.
Thank you. Come on down. While John is coming down, I want to thank Jim Lesar. By the way, talking about the records that we were just talking about, when, at least officially, the Central Intelligence Agency was reportedly stripped of its responsibility for monitoring the anti-Castro Cuban operations, Defense Intelligence, the Pentagon, and several other agencies, including Treasury and the FBI, were then commissioned to take up the slack. Sam Cale was such a person. He's an interesting figure. He always said that he thought their bills were still paid by the CIA. But he was in the Miami area frequently, and also in Dallas, as a liaison for the Defense Intelligence Agency, monitoring the anti-Castro Cubans, originally run by the CIA. He apparently worked, according to the records that I have, with a man whose name you might know. Joe Califano sent him down to the Pentagon to do the same job for the Pentagon, a man named Alexander Haig. So that we have some very interesting connections between people like Sam Cale and Alexander Haig, and J. Walden Moore, the domestic CIA intelligence man who was close to George Moorenshield. Close to George Moorenshield. Let's bring up John Judge. For the last 22 years, John Judge has researched political assassinations and other covert operations and hidden historical developments of what he calls, and I think rightly so, the national security state. Beginning his study of the murder of John F. Kennedy in '63, and then following that with his establishing the May Brussel Research Center in Santa Cruz, California, following May's death in '88, organizing her massive collection. Presently now, the founder of the Committee for an Open Archive. Let's welcome John Judge.
Well, good evening. Welcome to the New World Order. I guess Chicago is somewhat the appropriate place to be having a meeting in the sense that this was the home of Jack Ruby and his early mafia-related activities. Sparky from Chicago, as he was known. It's where Guy Bannister, along with Robert Mayhew, served in the FBI office here for many years. It's also where John F. Kennedy was scheduled to speak on November the 1st, 1963, and apparently the site of another planned assassination of him that fell through prior to the Dallas one that involved Thomas Arthur Valley. And it's the area where that plot was somewhat revealed by a Secret Service agent, Abe Bolden, who got into trouble because of trying to talk about that plot. It's also an area that was the home of key mafia figures like Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli and Richard Kane and Charles Nicoletti and others who figured into the case, and a number of whom were killed just before the House Select Committee opened its operations. And in fact, I found documents in my research that showed that when Sam Giancana was brought in to testify before the Rackets Commission in the 1950s, the McClellan Committee, and refused to testify and went to jail for contempt of Congress, there was a move to subpoena his right-hand man in the Waste Handlers Union, Jacob Rubenstein, or Jack Ruby, and a letter actually came in and exists in the records here in Chicago, addressed to the committee from Richard Milhouse Nixon, then Vice President of the United States, telling him not to subpoena that individual. So it's an area where I think there are positive leads that could be followed locally in relation to these assassinations. I was going to start out tonight, before we talk about Martin Luther King and that assassination, which I feel has many parallels to the Kennedy assassination that you've been hearing about today, with some discussion about the assassination files and the status. And from what I heard in the question session, much of that probably has already been covered by Jim Lesar, so I don't want to spend extra amount of your time going over small details. We co-founded, I should correct the introduction, Bill Kelly, a researcher from Ocean City, New Jersey, and myself, the Committee for an Open Archives back in November of last year, prior to the release of the JFK film, with no idea of the groundswell of interest that that film would create or the pressure it would put on getting the files loose. We did so after sort of years of informal debate between each other. Since we follow pretty much the same research tracks, but Bill always felt that it was important to try to get a special prosecutor and independent counsel in the case. We had both given up on the idea of an additional congressional investigation, but after years, I guess, of recalcitrance, I disabused him of that notion finally, trying to suggest that those people are foxes brought in to guard chicken coops in most cases. And I even have an article from the Washington Post, I live in D.C., where they suggest in this article that when it's time to pick an independent counsel, they pick them from about 1 or 2 dozen lawyers in the country who are the only ones they say that have the qualifications to do this kind of a job. And the one most recently picked, who's in the news now doing some rather startling things in relation to Bush and Reagan, Mr. Walsh, worked for a law firm that actually drew up the legal contracts for Southern Air Transport to carry the arms down to the Contras, and those same planes then were bringing the drugs back into the United States, by the best testimony we have. And he was asked at a press conference about whether that represented a conflict of interest, and he said it didn't, and I agreed, because the only conflict of interest would be if you put an honest lawyer in to investigate any of these cases, then you might come up with something. So I didn't expect that process would lead to much in terms of a special prosecutor, or in terms of what's been proposed for the review board or review panel that's going to be set up to look at these assassination materials using that same process. I didn't think, while it would remove it one step from the presidency, would get it very far. So we decided back in November last year to just call for an opening of the files, to kick the door open to the archives and do what we could to get a change in Congress. And what we've been attacking from the beginning is House Rule 36, which is not addressed in any of the pending legislation at all from anyone, but House Rule 36 is the actual legal rule that allows Congress to lock up its investigative files for periods of up to 50 years after they do an investigation. And it's under the authority of that rule that the House Select Committee documents were sealed. The Warren Commission documents were sealed under an executive order for 75 years by Lyndon Johnson. It wouldn't, under that timing, be out until 2038. House Select Committee would have been released in 2029 unless something changed. So we wanted to go at the rule that gave them the authority to do it, and also to make it possible for a change in the future, so that if tomorrow there's a new congressional investigation into the October surprise or into what Bush and Reagan had to do with that those documents aren't then automatically locked up for the next 50 years up into the next century. So we were trying to get at the heart of it, and that's what we first went after. And we approached Congressman Hughes from New Jersey, who in turn talked to Congressman Stokes, which apparently is the protocol in this situation, as everyone has to go to the chairman that originally insisted on locking him up in the beginning. And these people began to move, primarily not due to our pressure, but due to the groundswell of opinion for opening of files. I think it's important not to use a professional lobbying approach on these kinds of issues, although I think that things have been done by Hill and Knowlton and Frank Mankiewicz on behalf of Oliver Stone, and a certain amount of informal lobbying on the Hill has helped. But I think when you have an issue like this that really touches the grassroots in America and mobilizes people that wouldn't otherwise perhaps be reached by other political issues, that it's important to let those people participate in and benefit from whatever victory or movement forward you can get, and to let those people learn from that process about the reality of the politics in this country. And so I felt that our best approach was a nationwide petition, which we started, and it's been coming back. Thousands of signatures we get in every week from all around the country, and to try to put grassroots pressure and lobbying pressure on these people. So that's what the current issue of our newsletter prologue focuses on in one of the articles. We do have a list of the Congress members in the Senate and the House across the country who sit on the various committees. There were 4 House committees and 1 Senate committee to address this current legislation that's proposed in the Senate and House joint resolution. And so we feel that delegations of local people, phone calls and writing on behalf of interested researchers could have some effect, although it's more and more limited as the bill approaches the floor. But bills can even be amended on the floor if there's evidence of significant dissatisfaction with the way they're set up. Our main criticism of these bills that are being introduced, and I assume it would be the criticism of most of the people in the audience here, is that they are crafted essentially to take care of any tendency to veto on the part of the executive branch and Mr. Bush, who apparently has his own long history of intelligence operations that relate into the Kennedy assassination itself, and might have a vested interest in not letting files that have his name on it, or something that looks like his name, whether or not it's him, get back out into the public. And so kowtowing to that and allowing him to pick the board and to pick the various people, or even the incumbent, was one major hurdle. The other is to have a review board or a review or a sanitization in any sense, or a limitation of access to the records in any way. Because we basically do not agree politically with the idea that national security or intelligence sources and methods and other things can be substantially compromised in a situation where Lee Harvey Oswald, Sirhan Bashar Sirhan, and James Earl Ray, the supposed lone nuts of history, actually were responsible in that way for being lone assassins. How could that involve any issue of national security if in fact that's the truth? And so it's a contradiction, I think, in their part. There may be an occasional situation where a given witness gave testimony and their life was going to be threatened because they came forward and talked about somebody who didn't know that they spoke. But those are so rare as to probably not even be found for a period of time, much less cause any problem. And so our position was to kick the door open as wide as we can with what pressure we have now, and to use the groundswell of opinion, focus it politically to whatever extent we can in order to get the door open, and then to try to prop it open. In fact, we talked initially about having a logo on the newsletter that would show, you know, a crowbar on the ground in front of the archives with the 2 doors propped off the hinges. But I think that that's really what this situation deserves, because this is our history locked up in a box and taken away by this national security state, so that it's impossible for us to reconstruct in large measure what's happened. We don't take the position that there is nothing in these files. On the other hand, we're not naive enough to think that physical evidence wasn't initially destroyed, witnesses weren't killed, key documents haven't gone down the memory hole, as George Orwell called it, etc. In fact, one of the interesting deaths, and I've followed many, many deaths in relation to these cases, but one of the interesting ones came to my attention when friends of the family visited our house in D.C. Christmas time during the 1970s, and mentioned that a friend of theirs had been the person who worked at the National Archives, whose specific job position was the destruction of historical documents that were going to be destroyed for whatever purpose they were determined they wouldn't be maintained any longer. Well, I think this is Winston's job in 1984 over at the Ministry of Truth is to decide not what documents will go, but when it's decided to put them down the hole. And they told me that they were sad because this person had recently died of cancer. And I asked them whether it was a rather quick acting cancer, and they confirmed they were all shocked that he had died in a matter of weeks. I happen to know from my own work that close to 30 people in the John F. Kennedy assassination, witnesses and some of the investigating people and people in the committees, have died of very quick-acting cancers that I think are suspicious. So it may be that the person who helped to sanitize those documents all over the years is already dead himself. But in any case, there are documents there, and there's going to be something in those documents. And especially in terms of a knowledgeable research community, there's going to be something that we can piece together. I don't know if you know this, but during the Reagan years, they came up with new legislation and regulations on the federal level that would not classify documents, but make sure that agencies issuing certain types of documents created lists of people for whom those documents would be inaccessible, even though they weren't legally classified. And the reason they gave for this was quite interesting. They said that there are certain people in the society who seem to have an ability to look at just little pieces of a mosaic and garner from those the whole picture. I mean, if this doesn't describe conspiracy researchers and assassinationologists, I don't know what does, or the ones I've known, but those sort of people, us in other words, therefore shouldn't have access even to unclassified documents that might somehow give us a gleaning into how the state secret operations are working. And so they were to create blacklists that would make it impossible, I guess, for us to get Freedom of Information Act requests or to have access to certain libraries and other things. I found it interesting also, and I'm sure you've read about this, that the FBI was asking librarians to track people who were still going into libraries and trying to read. I think reading's a fairly subversive activity at this point in history. And, you know, Alan Dulles said, I mean, beyond the cynicism to say there's nothing in the files, Alan Dulles' cynicism, which was probably even better placed, was go ahead and print the 26 volumes of evidence. Nobody will read it anyway. And for the most part, the American public didn't read it. I imagine there's many more people sitting in this room clamoring for the release of the documents than would be willing to come to D.C. and sift through